Buenas tardes, bienvenidos al penúltimo panel presidencial de este LASA. Soy Emily McGuire, soy uno de los co-chairs del programa y me da muchísimo gusto presentar este panel, Infinite Debt. Debt is dispossession, expulsion, exploitation, a tool for dominating a state or community. It seeps down into intimate quotidian spaces. It is an extractive cruelty meted out on bodies and territories. This panel, which is, aside from myself, entirely virtual, will explore and discuss the genealogy of debt and its effects on bodies and economies, presence, and both domestic and national and international. I'm going to introduce today's moderator, Sorimar Rivera Montes, who will then go on to introduce our esteemed panelists. Sorimar is assistant professor of Latin American Studies and Spanish at Tulane University. She received her PhD from Northwestern University. Her work addresses Puerto Rican cultural production in the conditions of coloniality. And she has published in Histor, Latino Studies, and Sargasso, among other places. And I'm so pleased to welcome her and to welcome our esteemed panelists. Sorimar? Vanessa? I don't know how to signal to them that they can talk. Can they hear me? Okay. Sorimar?
Yes, we couldn't hear your introduction, but we'll go ahead and get started now. Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much to LASA and especially to you, Emily, for your invitation to have me here today and for putting together this wonderful panel. It is one of the biggest honors, crazy honor of my career to get to introduce these luminaries of feminist, anti-colonial, racial thoughts to everybody today. The format will be that each of them will offer some brief remarks and I'll follow up with some questions and then open up for audience questions, both in person and I'll be monitoring questions in the chat as well. So I'll start by introducing each of the three speakers and then they'll have approximately 8 minutes, give or take, to offer their remarks. First off, we have no other than Silvia Federici, a renowned scholar and Marxist feminist activist based in New York. She is a professor emerita and teaching fellow at Hofstra University in New York State, and one of the leading feminist theoreticians in Marxist feminist theory, women's history, political philosophy, and the history and theory of the commons. Her most famous book, Caliban and the Witch, has been translated into more than 20 foreign languages, and other publications include Wages Against Housework from 1975, Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle, Re-Enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons, Witches, Witch Hunting and Women, and most recently, Patriarchy of the Wage, Notes on Marx, Gender, and Feminism. For several decades, she has organized with feminist organizations from Nigeria to Argentina and New York, all over the world. And in 1972, she co-founded the International Feminist Collective, the organization that launched the campaign for wages for housework. And after Silvia, we will be moving on to Denise Ferreira da Silva, who is a Brazilian philosopher and artist with an anti-colonial Black feminist perspective that highlights the centrality of raciality in post-Enlightenment thought. She is a professor at New York University and has worked at a range of other academic institutions that include the University of British Columbia, Paris 8th University Vicente Saint-Denis, Monash University in Australia, Queen Mary University of London, the University of Southern California, and University of California, San Diego. Her books include Toward a Global Idea of Race from 2007, A Dívida Impagável from 2019, Unpayable Debts in 2022, and Race, Empire, and the Crisis of the Subprime from 2013, co-edited with Paula Chakrabarty. Her artistic work includes the films Sud Breath, Corpus Infinitum, Four Waters, Deep Implicancy, and Serpent Rain. And finally, we will hear from Rocio Zambrana, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras. She teaches and writes about the epistemic and historical material basis of capitalist modernity and its racial gender orders, specifically from decolonial thought and praxis, particularly in the context of financial capitalism in the Caribbean. She has published the books Colonial Debts, The Case of Puerto Rico from 2021, and Hegel's Theory of Intelligibility in 2015. She also co-edited Hypatia, a journal of feminist philosophy from fall 2018 to 2024, and has also taught at Emory University and the University of Oregon. Her current book project is titled Metamorphosis of Value, Epistemic Protocols in the Longue Durée, which traces the emergence of figures of speculation endemic to capitalism through a consideration of the trade plantation complex in the early modern Caribbean. So the floor is yours.
Okay, I think I really decided that I'll go first, and I want to say that I'm very happy to be here, to thank Lhasa to have invited me, and it's really a pleasure to be with Denise and with Rocio, and I'll try to be all within my 8 minutes. If I go over to 9, forgive me. So I thought I would give a very general overview about the question of the debt, the impact of the debt on the population of the world, and in particular on women. Debt, public and private, is like a plague that for decades has spread across the world, causing mass impoverishment, ecological destruction, and the displacement of millions who have been forced to migrate. It has turned entire regions into sacrifice zones. It is important to stress that this global debt crisis was artificially created, starting with the decision by the Federal Reserve of the United States to raise in 1979 the interest rate on the dollar, which made the loans formerly colonized countries had taken for development projects unpayable. Debt and the structural adjustment programs that were imposed on so-called debtor nations in the name of economic recovery have forced countries to cut all subsidies to social reproduction, healthcare, education, mass transport, has forced them to drastically devalue their currency, privatize land and services, dismantle their economies, open their doors to imported goods, to agribusiness and extractivist companies that have sacked their wealth and carry on ecological disaster. In this way, the global debt, together with the wars and the militarization of territories that it has produced, has been the main instrument of the restructuring of the global economy and the expansion of capitalist relations. It has been, above all, an instrument of recolonization and disciplining of the global workforce, as people are now forced to work more intensely and accept more exploitative conditions to repay their debt. First applied in the former colonial world, it has soon been extended by neoliberal policies throughout the planet, but it has affected people in different ways according to a racist and gender discriminating logic that has made women and generally people in the colonies those who have carried the main cost. Much can be said about the ways in which the manufacture and imposition of debt on formerly colonized people has been justified by a racist ideological campaign attributing the misery and conflict caused by the debt to cultural backwardness, undue attachment to tradition, and tribalism. I will concentrate, however, on the effect of the debt on women and reproduction, so destructive that some women feminists have defined debt a war on the autonomy of women. from Africa to Latin America, Asia. That today is the main cause of women's migration. Indebted women are now the domestic workers of the world, working often in conditions of near slavery. This is because, due to structural adjustment, women have lost their already precarious employment and what land they had, and the money they earn is constantly devalued. Those who remain, even to buy food, have now to get into debt, so that we can speak of a financialization of reproduction and of new forms of capitalist accumulation through the exploitation of reproductive work. Add the cuts in social services and the ecological devastation caused by extractivist activities have much intensified this work and affected people's health. In many African countries, women now have to walk miles to get access to water, which local governments no longer provide. And they have to take care of the diseases caused by the increasing use of pollutants that contaminate land and water as agriculture is being industrialized. As the feminist concept of the body territory suggests, the diseases of the land are immediately reflected in diseases of the bodies. Malnutrition, cuts in medical care, degraded environmental conditions are certainly the main causes of the constant epidemics. But there's also the anxiety that is generating. Doctors now speak of a money anxiety syndrome. Not last, that boosted patriarchalism, making women more dependent on men, forcing them often to stay in violent relations, keeping in mind that increases the tension and violence in the families. The microcredit programs introduced by banks and international organizations, presumably to alleviate women's poverty, have only added to the problem. Far from helping, they have been a trap, since women can never repay these loans and only plunge further into debt and more intense exploitation. Not accidentally, worldwide resistance and protest against the debt repayment is increasingly led by women. Women are also resorting to different strategies to cope with the debt. In Africa, they have returned to traditional methods of saving, like the tontines. In many countries, they've organized audits of public records to question the legitimacy of the public debt. In Argentina, Nuna Menos and other women's groups, together with unions, have called for a reproduction strike. In addition, almost every struggle across the world over housing, healthcare, employment is related to the problem of debt. In Greece, women have refused to pay on public transport. But the most promising factor in the struggle against debt today is that there is now a global movement led by women who understand that unless we force government to adopt policies that valorize the reproduction of life, providing money, services, resources in its support, we will not be able to obtain any significant victory, no matter what we do and where we are. A first step some women's networks have taken has been to turn the table and ask who owes to whom, who is the real creditor, showing that the capitalist class and all governmental institutions all over the world owe women an immense wealth, as they are those who for generations have worked to reproduce the world's labor force. In 2015, in several countries of Europe, women have paid local government, presented to local government the bill, precisely in this spirit. The task ahead then is the construction of broad popular movement, commoning a common ground, and in pursuance of this past, acknowledging the continuity between the different areas of life that are affected by the debt, joining in a common cause to produce an international anti-debtor movement that not only refuses to pay the debt, but is committed to the construction of a society where life is not sacrificed for the sake of private accumulation of wealth and the logic of the market, so that no debt can ever be reproduced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. We now turn to Denise.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily and Laza, for the invitation to be part of this panel. And thanks, Dorimar, for the introduction and for moderating us. And it's really a huge pleasure to share this screen with Sylvia and Rocio and you, Dorimar. Let me start with how I have understood the task at hand. So the invitation is to speak of that at once as an extractive and coercive mechanism, as a political mechanism, political, economic, juridic, and ethic. And the questions that were in the invitation, I found they brought into consideration that as an existential given, right, where indebtedness becomes a descriptor of our social and personal landscape, something that it's built and something that is felt in both levels. So in response to how I understood the invitation, I'm going to speak about how I'm trying to approach that as also from the ethical point of view, in particular in the ethic moment of the post-Enlightenment political architecture, which is the one where I find raciality doing its most powerful work for capital, for the state capital. And I will try to do it in less than 9 minutes, so let's see. But in this short time, I'll try to convey how, instead of rendering that in terms of a relation, the approach I have in mind, and I'm calling it raw materialist for short, it images that as constitutive, as constituting and a constituent of the current global situation. And also, of course, as a functioning of the racial, right? The racial understood as a non-epistemological signifier, a tool of symbolic power that maps, because it is mapped onto the planet as a political context. So the simplest way I found to introduce it is by changing the focus from the question of who owes what to whom, which Sylvia just mentioned and which I have also thought with, and I still do, but I'm changing here from that question to the unpacking of other related questions. So why do a person or a country get into that? Why do they borrow or rent? And then I'm assuming that there are only two answers for these questions. I know better, but I'm just assuming there are only two answers. One is to meet a need, the other is to satisfy a desire. So lack then becomes a term that, it serves both well, both of the answers, but I like it also because it accentuates a generative ambiguity, because it conveys and collapses the meaning of necessity and liberty. So lack refers to missing something that can be material, something that we cannot exist without, and also aspirational. It would something that would be nice to have it. So my general argument that I'm not even getting close here is just suggests that this approach to racial power emphasize that as playing out in the material. So I'm talking about it, but not a lot. It's just that. Okay, so when lack is in the register of desire, of liberty, that is aspirational, ethical significance is addressed as a private matter, always personal or national, if you're talking about the country. And that I mean that we think of that in terms of a decision, and as such, the assumption is that it results from a choice, a free choice. and not from the imposed political, juridical, economic, symbolic situation, not imposed by the situation. And these, so what I mean is that the usually activated ground for considering that is liberty, not necessity. So an example was the 2007-2008 crisis of the subprime. So news coverage and pundits analysis blamed that global economic crisis unleashed by the subprime loans on those economically dispossessed Black, Latinx, many migrant persons, many of whom were, I don't know, maybe most of them were women. They were blamed for the crisis, but they were involved in it because they were forced to take variable rate loans called subprime. So, but the experiment here. So what if we addressed that decision to take on those loans as a material, a fundamental one, meaning one that speaks to the political context, in that case, the global historical situation that renders these particular loans and only these available to them in the first place. So when Paula and I deployed the phrase unpayable debt in the introduction to the special issue of American Quarterly on the crisis back in 2012, a significant aspect of what we want to do was to take that out of the register of desire, why did they borrow, and ask the other question of why they took on loans. Both they and their lenders knew they could not pay. And the question already situates the relationship they entered, obviously, in the context of what kind of borrowing was available to them. In this case, loans that they could not pay, but which were extremely valuable financial goods, precisely because it was known that they could not be paid by those who took them. So that prior knowledge gives the racial situation. That is, the value of the mortgage was not on that of the houses or the specific private circumstances of borrowers and lenders, but to the public global context, that is the financial market and its prime and subprime loan packages and the securities market in which these mortgage-based packages were, in which they circulated as commodity. So we make this explicit in that introduction, but I only elaborated it further in Unpayable Debt in the 2022 book when, as I'm writing with Octavia Butler's character, Dana's obligation to travel back in time to save the life of her own ancestor. And that obligation allowed me to think of something an obligation, a debt that was not originated in a free agreement, and as such is not aspirational, but was thoroughly material. In her case, existential, because had he died as a child, should not have been born. And yes, the fact that Butler's character's ordeal unleashes when she moves into her own home didn't hurt, the case. But in regards to those, back to those blamed for the global economic crisis of 2007, 2008, the answer to the question why they borrowed is aspirational. Yes, they did so. They borrowed to buy their house, their first houses, but it's also material. They borrowed because these variable rate loans made it possible for them to borrow and to buy a house, something they wouldn't be able to do through the common mortgage because of their lack of equity, right? Because of this negative accumulation, historical accumulation, that is centuries of economic expropriation and extraction under colonial racial, cis-heteropatriarchal subjugation. Also, these loans were very aspirational from the point of view of global financial capital, as these borrowers' lack of equity, encapsulated in the subprime loans, was a most profitable financial raw material, as the whole system comes to crumble when they default. Of course, so they were holding the market. So that gives us a sense of how the powers of the racial as a symbolic tool is realizable economically. And as such, it renders that specific moment and the whole of the global economy a racial situation. We are just dealing with them, and we are just dealing right now with another racial situation, which is not economic, it's juridic. And that's the sense in which I'm proposing we consider, this is the sense of the materialist approach or critique of capital that is guiding what I'm thinking here in terms of the tracking of the operations of the colonial racial cis heteropatriarchal matrix. But just to conclude briefly, we know from the 1885 Berlin Conference and the imperial projects following it, the ways in which the racial has mapped the global context. We remember it from the early 20th century in Hitler's regime, and not long ago in this early 21st century, we saw it operating as the unspoken key to Jair Bolsonaro's authoritarian presidency as a head of state, as a head of the Brazilian state. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We now move on to Rocio Zambrana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to Lasa for the invitation. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Sorimar, for moderating and acompañarnos, being with us, thinking with us, and to Silvia and Denise, always for all their work. So in her very recently, in fact, just a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago, her very recently published La Subasta Nuestra, Post Deuda y Posibilidad, roughly our auction, post debt and possibility, Ariadna Godrobert speaks of the time after debt. El tiempo después. She writes, estos son los tiempos de la subasta, del acabose, de la posposibilidad. These are the times of auction, the end of post-possibility, end quote. Next year marks 10 years of promesa in the Puerto Rican archipelago. Technically, we are still in debt. Puerto Rico is still living under a debt regime, and it's the consequences that I explore in my book. However, today what I'm interested in is a philosophical reflection of the three key terms of the book: subasta, acabose, post-posibilidad. So auction, the end, and post-possibility. The time after defies the classical Western view of modality, particularly in the Kantian and post-Kantian critical tradition, moving beyond actuality and possibility. And what I want to do in my 7 minutes is introduce the three terms for our discussion, so put them on the table, providing a very brief commentary on each. So I'll just be kind of sharing you Ariadna's work. Subasta, auction, and I quote, and this is my kind of rough translation. We begin by locating the post or poles, las astas, the call to auction. The colony is always the spoils of war, so it would be safe to say, linking etymology with poetry and reality as it should be, that the call to our auction was the superposition of knife neck, prophet subject, desire, need, doing, saying. The auction is not a space for haggling or negotiation. It is the culmination of a process of foreclosure. Of foreclosure, it would suffice to say, there where the loot and the shroud are divided according to the condemned man's ability to survive. The auction is always a case of every man for himself. At an auction, no one is saved. Everything goes, end quote. That bind that in 2016 we conceived of as parasitic on the sociality of the promise, robbing us of the future, is now consummated. The house, the land, the coast, the body, time itself has been lost. There is no longer a promise. The future has been given over. Sometimes Goudreau will say that it is too soon to say this, but the point is that it is too late to speak of debt. There are no longer binds that hold us to the future that is not our own. All there is the relation between la acreencia and la carencia, the balance in favor and privation, or perhaps lack. With Denise, the exaltation of privation. She says, almost all collection agencies have names in English of birds and islands. An investment fund is a trust. To trust is to confiar. In God we trust is the sum of the confianza of an empire, its promise of the future, the erasure of the past, the exaltation of a lack or privation, end quote. Debt has stripped us of the body, land, coast, sea, time, the other, not through displacement from the territory, but in the territory, as Anaira Santori says. Speculation and reality have collapsed in this consummation. Prices have been set, the body is up for sale, a sale is imminent, it has been sold. We are no longer speaking of a temporal gap, an asymmetry that defers. A property title now holds any movement purportedly forward. Acabóse. Esto se acabó, vida, la ilusión se fue vieja y el tiempo es mi enemigo. Gaudreau Bert writes, citing Rubén Blades. This is over, my life. The illusion is turned old and time is my enemy. For some time now, she says, and I'm quoting, I responded greetings by saying, here looking at the end of the world that occupies us. And I no longer feel sad when I say it. I don't have the burden of being a prophet of anything, of anyone, of any place. I've been wrong before, end quote. The end that occupies us, that sets new coordinates for the no place and no lugar for those readers of Las Propias, of colonialism, is the end of debt. Its productivity is no longer tied to futurity, but marks the fire sale that has stripped us of our body, of time itself. The history of colonial seizure and of fire sales is long, its birth in the trade itself. Now is the time of the sale of enclosure that cannot be undone, but only passed on at a different price. Again, speculation and reality have collapsed. Yet we shall not mourn the death of the time of debt, of the colony, I would say. The end that occupies us marks post-debt as the post-possible. Stripped of possibility by being stripped of actuality requires new philosophical categories. There is no time to review Kant's postulates of empirical thinking, or Hegel's notion of reciprocity in the doctrine of essence, or Heidegger's insistence on possibility. Or perhaps there is only time to review these mystifications that sustain the previously known gap between speculation and reality. But here and now, that an object or a life could be, actually is, or must be, is of no concern. Debt has passed over from bind to sheer accident, she says, in which the accrual and privation are indistinguishable. The binds and bonds that occupy us, that made possible the loss of our body, are the arbitrary bonds of a colonial order running out of patience. Will the colony run out of patience? For now, she says, what remains is an inventory. Post-possibility. Gaudreau writes possibility in the title of the book, but in the book itself, she repeats time and time again, post-possibility. Did you say privation, recalling an encounter and reflecting it on the book? And she says, this is Gaudreau, and I correct her without saying anything. Yes, from auction and privation or lack. Bankruptcy. That's the measure of the impossible balance, el salvamento, end quote. To rescue. What to rescue? Of what is consummated, of the loss, what is to be saved? I prepare myself for a war, she writes, to balance myself and save, for after the dearth, which is not always abundance, but the opposite of hunger. Balance in favor, or acreencia. I did not translate that as credit, but balance in favor. El salvamento is, on the one hand, she says, each person for themselves, each saves them for the savage, for the shipwreck, for fire. There is no room for heroic acts or martyrdom, but only for entering and leaving with what is most precious, end quote. She says that we have been trained for looting. El salvamento, or rescuing, on the other hand, she writes, and I quote again, es revolú y pataleo. It's bargaining with the circumstances that resist the accident. In the face of fire or collapse, we pounce without measuring our strength or manners. It doesn't matter whether it's the bank that's coming for the car or the creditors for the debt, whether zombies are attacking us, whether we're eating each other, or it's another version of the apocalypse that befalls us. To rescue is looting for innovation and survival. We loot because our promises have collapsed. The ones made to us, the ones we made, the ones we shared among ourselves. That assesses that in time of the accident, what defines us is not the time, but its interruption. If they take everything, even that, what remains is only the aftermath, the end. What remains of the promise is the question, and the question of an unfinished promise is the only thing that can be saved when nothing is left, when they have taken everything, end quote. Post-possibility, then a modal category that tells us not that something could be or actually is or must be, not that the necessary is what asserts itself from the concreteness of the contingent, but that the time of arbitrariness is interrupted by the scramble to save what is precious, letting the end be the end. What will save? What will we save in the wake of this loss of this world? An end long overdue. So to close, she writes, and I quote her again, precisely because I'm afraid to let go and I'm writing this book knowing that it's a resounding fall, I timidly provoke her, her friend, with comments about the end, about post-possibility and the time of the auction. Are they taking everything, sister? I say yes, and they took it a while ago. And she looks at me with her eyes of fire and vivid violets and answers, if it has fallen, it will fall, and it won't be through my mouth and hands. I see her being a fire in darkness, and although I'm not convinced, I take refuge in her warmth. She pushes me, and the fall begins. She throws herself with me. Neither of us knows how to fly, but we love each other so much. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for these three very wonderful presentations and reflections that we have heard that I think complement each other so well. And I have a couple questions to maybe get our conversation started. I'll say both of them. And then let you each speak and do what you will with the questions. And after that, we'll open up to audience questions. The first question that I'd like to ask is the perhaps unavoidable question that has kind of already been touched upon about how the relationship between the debt regime, debt governance that has so well been framed throughout this conversation, and our current political climate. I would like to hear you speak how you see the relationship between the ascension of a fascist regime led by a patriarchal class of techno-capitalist financial speculation, which is not entirely new, but has reached a place of power and authority that it did not have before. So how does that relate to intensify this regime that you all have been laying out? And how, if we understand it, perhaps it's too early for that, but as a kind of new social order, how may it open up spaces or cracks in the regime of debt, this new order that we are looking at? So that as a first question. And then my other reflection in listening to you speak, and as I prepared for this event today, I am myself, my home discipline is literature and cultural studies. And as I was reading your work, of course, with Denise is a visual artist, you're a visual artist yourself, and the Unpayable Debt book is predicated, as you were just saying, on this literary reading of Octavia Butler's Kindred to construct your arguments. And if we go further back, right, Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch does a similar maneuver in that the argument is also resting on a literary reference of Shakespeare's Caliban to make an argument about the relationship between capitalism and gender. And Rocio and Colonial Depths, you also, and even what you've done just now, right? The reading of Ariadna Godreau, who is a legal thinker and a philosophy. I struggle to classify her, but also a very literary writer in the way that she employs rhetoric. That is also that you yourself also do, and Colonial Depths open with this poem by Roque Salas Rivera. And as we face the regime of debt as this great form of abstraction, it's my hunch, right, that these ventures into the terrain of representation are ways of making it concrete, right, of trying to untangle the abstraction that debt represents. So I would like to hear you speak a little bit more about the role of representing way as a way of making its dispossession more legible or more concrete. We know that this abstraction of debt is designed to blur wide and common understanding, to posit debtors as culpable, as Denise has just said, to make it about individual choices rather than structural forces. So the role of representation in this setup that you all have done. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So I will answer briefly. I guess I begin, we go to the same order, and I'm not sure I can answer really the second question. I really have to think more about the second question, but I'll try to answer the first one and say that I think there is a direct continuity between the history of structural adjustment which really begins in the early 1980s and what is happening today. We are seeing now, in a sense, the slogan that comes to mind is the rooster coming home. We are now seeing the completion of a process that begins in the 1980s with the recolonization of a large part of the so-called third world, and through the instrument, primarily through the instrument of the debt, and then of course more and more through militarization, through wars, because you cannot have the kind of devastation, dispossession that I've described without at the same time the use of violence of different forms, whether it is the paramilitary, the protecting the works of the oil companies, mining companies, or whether it is actual warfare or the narco traffickers whose job is to, like the war on drugs, whose job is to terrorize people and forcing them to leave their lands. Whether it is, in any case, clearly the violence, the death is the first stage, but then the violence is inevitable. And this complete destruction of what constitutional guarantee, democratic rights, human rights. In fact, human rights has been used as an instrument of intervention. In 2002, at the time of the first Intifada, I wrote a piece which is called "Palestine is the World," where I was saying, in Palestine already at the time, schools and hospitals are being destroyed, but they're being destroyed in Africa. They're being destroyed through structural adjustment, through the IMF, and so on. It will take a long time to even describe what the conditionality that the IMF has imposed, on the so-called debtor nation, in order, for economic recovery, repayment, to really, so many, that, for example, the destruction of food reserve. Traditionally, countries had reserves. They protected them against famine, against calamities. They had, in order to renegotiate a payment, they had to destroy those reserves. So they've been completely exposed, right? And on and on. So I would say that there is a continuity. continuity of a system, of an economic political system that in fact now has no spaces left for the negotiation, has no spaces left for allowing, investment in the social reproduction. I think we are in a very, very dangerous situation. And I think there is much that we need to learn, looking at the movements that over the ages, over the last decades, have responded to basically the devastation of the communities, movement of all type, movement against extractivism, all of that connected with the question of the debt. All of that connected with the question of the debt. I think we have much to learn from this movement, because they will tell us now, as I said in my conclusion, not only, post-possibility means we need to reconstruct another society. Post-possibility is that the society that it was constituted, and a society that made the indebtedness possible as a society that is not sustainable. It's a society that is not viable. It's a society that we need to go beyond. And this, I think, makes it very, very important to see the power that has come, to understand the power that has come to all the different avenues the people have searched to fight against the debt, which are multiple, and the network that just exists. The network that still are existing. And this is my answer.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zolimar, for the question, and then thanks, Sylvia, for the answer. I mean, I don't know what else one can add, but I could just say that I make the connection at the end of my initial presentation, and what I'm trying to highlight there is it's precisely, I think, the invitation to think about this particular moment, as Sylvia was saying, as part of a larger process, a longer process of consolidation of capital. Somehow we don't know exactly where it's going to end, but it's moving this way for many decades now. But then at the same time, we see mechanisms as that working through, along with, and through old political tools like raciality and patriarchy, etc. So it may be, maybe now folks will pay attention to the operation of these modalities of power and come up with, we can join in assembling different ways of, putting together the critique of capital that doesn't leave anything behind, that doesn't, repeat other choices. But we don't have to go there now. So, about the second question, I was trying to think, like, how do I do it? So I do it by thinking with artists and their artwork, and I do it with my artwork, and I'm not saying what is it that I do, and I do it also creating objects, like equations, that I make them work as if they are analytical pieces, but they're actually, I think, more like artistic objects than anything else. So I think, on the one hand, in doing those things, right? On the one hand, that is something that is kind of playful in there, in the experimenting, and because thinking is crucial in that, that experimenting, thinking in different ways, including creating a quote unquote tool for thinking, like the wounded captive body in the scene of subjugation. But why I do it, I think, and I think why I can't say generalize why we do it, but so I can only speak in the first person in regards to the question. It has something to do. There is a movement in moving from themes that are in the critical, theoretical, philosophical literatures into the artistic field. that is something that could be called a translation, but I don't think, and this is the point about whether it's to make things more intelligible. I don't think the translation has to do with meaning, making it closer or more concrete or more accessible. I think the translation is more spatial, from one place modality way of thinking to another one. So it's a dislocation of the themes and questions, and then the dislocation breaks up some things that we take, some things we are used to in terms of thinking, and then we can reflect on the issues and themes, I think, beyond the limits of critical theoretical thinking. Just makes you think about things, right? You're able to add stuff that you would not dare to if you're just being strict and, reading, I don't know, Marx or Hegel or whatever. So I think this translation, this removing from here to there, opens up something else to thinking itself. And then whether or not it becomes more intelligible, I don't know, sometimes it becomes really less intelligible when the act can be helpful. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for those questions and replies. I'm not sure what to say either about, but what has already been said about the new forms capitalist, or the long durée of what is kind of new rounds of accumulation that kind of also repeat certain gestures of kind of violence and repression. So I think that that's perhaps all we can say right now. I think also I was at a different conference and everyone was asked kind of the same question. Tell us something about what is happening right now, especially in the US. And I think in Puerto Rico, it is very interesting how the current juncture, what will happen, I think also politically in terms of the erosion of kind of a political imaginary that is captured by this idea of survival through our relationship to the US if federal funds, for example, are lost. So that remains to be seen as well. And I think that some of the forms of violence and the forms that capital's forms of accumulation are happening, have been well exercised in the colonial world. So there we have much to learn from those experiences. So what I think is important is the question of the juncture, the question that I tried to kind of also pose a bit in my remarks which is what is it that we want to save? And so why I think it's so important, this notion of post-possibility. I think there's a lot of kind of retrenchment of certain features, political features, certain mappings, to use Denise's words, certain ways in which the planet has been mapped racially, so on, that should not be the places that are fought to remain because they represent some sort of alternative to what we have been seeing and what we're seeing in so many places. So I think that that's the question that we should also be asking us. What is it that is to be saved, and what is it that is to be built on or built upon? With respect to the second question, I think that the term abstraction is very tricky because I'm a philosopher. I work in philosophy, and I treat the Western canon as very important because it is also a body that has been at work in structuring reality. So it's something that that we need to kind of know to also be able to move beyond. So I think that abstraction is a very tricky, it's a very tricky term. I think that in Puerto Rico people know exactly how being indebted feels because austerity impacts everything, every aspect of life. So I don't know if debt is abstract. And I don't know that we have to give it more body. Sometimes I think we have to give it abstraction. We have to try to conceptualize, to try to understand it, to move beyond the experience, but try to name it and to also translate it. Not thinking that something like philosophy or literature, poetry, other art, other forms of representation, that they're either also abstract or concrete. So I don't know that I think these are super helpful terms. I think that they're we try to find different bodies to understand what befalls us, and that sometimes that seems abstract, and sometimes it seems too concrete, and we can't actually see and name and move beyond it. So I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we still have a generous amount of time for questions from the audience. That can be the audience that is in the room in San Francisco, or here, people that are listening virtually can post their questions on the chat, and I will be monitoring those and asking them.
Sorimar,
Yes.
maybe we should start with, maybe we should alternate one from the chat if there are any, and then one from the audience.
Sounds great.
And
yeah.
I can walk around. Vanessa will walk around.
Perhaps I can start. Okay, with only one. My thank you for the presentations, and thank you for the conversation and to be here in LASA. My question is about temporality, or about the future. I would like to ask not so much or not only what to do or how to resist debt. Rather, I would like to ask in conceptual or theoretical terms, what are the exits or the outskirts of the debt? ¿No? Los afueras o las salidas de la deuda. I don't know, saving, community, resistant to pay, perhaps? Thank you.
Shall we take another question, or?
Yeah.
Es que no veo a nadie.
Or perhaps we can take another one from online.
I don't think we have online yet.
One online. If not, while people are thinking, we can start with that one.
Yes, I think we don't have questions online yet, so I think we can start with this question and move forward.
I don't know, I can start. I think that by now, over the last, particularly since 2008, particularly since, by even before, there's been now such a rich history of struggle that I think we can turn to see all the different ways. I mentioned a few all the different ways. So it's true that we are at the time of the subasta. At the same time, still, new children are born, community, not everybody migrates, not everybody, and so the struggle goes on even after all the possibility, after everything has been lost. And I think that it is very important to look, I liked very much Denise's presentation because it triggered something which had to do with when you talk about desire, the people, women and men took these loans, not only because they needed it, but also because they desired. And I think that is important. What triggered was the question of guilt. See, and that is a particular form of war, of attack, that is particularly dangerous and devastating because most of the time it isolates you. It is different to be in a struggle. For example, if you are in a factory, you're fighting for a wage increase or against something that they have done to you. It's a collective. There you have no doubt that you're being exploited. But that tends to, most people tend to withdraw. Many people, once they are in debt, they feel that, oh, I took too much. It was my guilt. I mismanaged the money. We saw that because I was somewhat involved, even though peripheral to the struggle of students on our campuses. And there was an organization called the Strike Debt Collective here in New York. And one of the things that they would do, every meeting, they would ask people to say loud what they owed, precisely because they realized that this sense of guilt. So this is one of the things that is very important to overcome the sense that, but also there's been now a very rich, there's nothing to save. That is when you're beyond saving. Saving, there's absolutely nothing to save, right? But I think that the question of resistance, I think on the local level, resistance may have to do with refusing to pay. There's a lot of movements that are bringing together people to refuse payment. And there are many different forms. Women have made caravans going through communities, right, protesting against the debt. They have created caravans, of bringing support to communities where everything had been lost. So again, there is a rich history. But I want to conclude to say that it is important not only to fight the debt, but also most fundamental, and here connecting with what Rocio was saying, what is that needs to be saved and what is that does not need to be saved. The question of constructing a society, where there's no question of that. Constructing a society where, the land is returned, the resources are returned, where we have a control of the resources that are most necessary for our social reproduction. I think that the two struggle against and for cannot be separated.
Thank you. Wonderful. Would Denise or Rocio also want to say something, or should we move on? I have a couple more questions now. Okay. There's a question in the Q&A that is quite similar, so I'll read it, but then also read another one. Quite similar to what you just referred to, Sylvia. So Sylvia, you mentioned the need to study earlier movements against capitalism and infinitization of debt. Do any immediate models come to mind? And I think you've just offered some, but you can keep that in the back if you want to expand on it. And we have another question in the chat. I'm going to read it in Spanish and then translate it into English. María Luisa Rodríguez says, me he quedado pensando en la deuda desde la producción académica, en el sentido de si también es posible analizar cómo somos absorbidas por la producción del norte y nuestro trabajo en Latinoamérica depende del reconocimiento del norte y cómo surge el mismo como una deuda con sus universidades que nos reconozcan. And I'll do a shoddy quick translation of that. I have been thinking about debt from the vantage point of academic production in the sense of whether it is possible to analyze how we are absorbed by the production, academic production in the North, and our work in Latin America depends on recognition from the North and how that surges as a kind of debt with our universities to be recognized. I don't know who would like to tackle that first.
Well, I think I should be answering a question right now. Not that I can answer the question, but I probably can respond. But before, just maybe a couple of things in response as maybe a commentary back to the question, the first question about how if there is a way out of that. I guess that's was the question, or if there is some other place, a place other than that. And so I Sylvia was answering and commenting on the guilt, shame element, right? The affective effects of that. It two things came to my mind. On the one hand, I was trying to think, I can't think of a place outside of that. In the sense, and that's probably, I mean, I have some, well, because I grew up in Brazil in the 80s, maybe it occupies my imagination, but beyond that, right? I can't, but more than the fact that I can't think of existing without that, whether it is the debt, the foreign debt, or the debt that my parents have to get into because they didn't have any money, they don't come from money, or the unpayable debt that I write about. I think it seems to me that the first, among the first moves, one is to really get rid of guilt and shame and deal with that for what it is, right? As we are, we all know, as a political mechanism of extraction. I think, and this is a difficult work because it's, of course, it's a political work to be done, but that operating at that level usually doesn't come as something that makes sense from the point of view of our political organizing, right? You organize, you want to provide the best analysis of the situation, but we don't really work towards creating ways or tools for dealing with the effective effects of power. It's always something that's privatized. Now, the person has to deal with how she's affected personally. So it may be now, and I think, many have been saying that in different ways, but it's about time we seriously deal with the effective effects of power, and that being an instrument of power would be dealt with in this way. To the question of the academic production, I don't know. I know I was trained in Brazil. When I came to the US, I had a master's degree in sociology, and I found sociology in the US completely different than how I saw it in Brazil back in the 80s. And I never abandoned my Brazilian sense of what the social sciences are supposed to be all about. And hence, I'm always a bit weird in doing so many different things. So, but then at the same time, those of us who, like me, who came who migrated, right, to work in the US, of course, we bring the ways in which we formulate, or even the questions that we attend to and how we attend to those questions, end up being, kind of defined by the conversations we are engaged in here. And I know it's different for different people. But I don't think, and that was the point in toward the global idea of race, and I'm going to use some time to talk about it, because when I initially wanted, because I think makes sense in the context of the question, even though it's not about that. When I thought initially about the comparison I was going to do between racial subjugation in Brazil, the US, and South Africa was part of it, I thought I could. I thought sociology had the tools I needed for doing the comparative work. And then when I started working on it, I realized that the tools I had that I could use to do the comparative work were all native categories of the US. So I had to do everything I do toward the global idea of race, so as to be able to talk about racial subjugation in Brazil and the US without presuming the native categories, right? And by that I mean that if you think in terms of the social sciences, for instance, but not only, the concepts and categories we have, they are not, I mean, they pretty much reflect the ways in which those social sciences have been deployed towards thinking the world, and have been also mapped onto the world. So even though the national state boundaries make a difference, I don't think they make a total difference. They may change how we inflect some terms and how we ask questions, but the tools are the same. And then if there is a problem with them, as in the case of the tools of sociology of race relations, the issues I found with it, if there is a problem with them, then the problem is not cannot be blamed or reduced to a particular nation state's ways of dealing with the questions, formulating the questions, or the kind of concepts that become more crucial because of the local domestic situation. So, okay, that is the whole more institutional part of the question that I'm not going to touch on, but in terms of the content, I'd like to say that.
Thank you. Elsia, do you want to go ahead and say something?
Yeah, maybe I can say something about one thing that is interesting. I'll say about the conversations regarding both questions. One thing that is interesting in this book that I was offering pieces of to you is that there is also a gesture of all the ways that people avoid debt and affirm their own kind of integrity against debt. So I do think that there's a lot of shame and guilt that is tied to kind of the castigating forms, the racializing forms that are political arms in imposing that on populations. But I do also think that there is a lot of ways that people. I don't want to take away the agency of a lot of people who know exactly what that is doing to them and the ways that they ignore, escape, and the other forms of binding that they generate and they try to generate through forms of, perhaps we can say, social reproduction that try to kind of make you relevant, despite the fact that state and capital will always come for you. So I do think that it's important to think about guilt and shame, but I also think that there's something very important about all the ways that people are always moving against and beyond it, even beyond kind of frontally organizing against the debt vis-a-vis states or economic interests. And with respect to the political economy or the questions about academia, I did a reverse migration, which a lot of people don't understand. But it was my desire, my deepest desire. And I think for purposes of, I mean, I think that other worlds exist. There's a lot, there are other epistemic centers. And I think that just undermining the power that just one imperial epistemic center reproduces because of the political economy of academia, I think it's important to recognize that knowledge production exists even within academia beyond the US, but also in other spaces. I think it's important also because there is an epistemic closure that occurs with the discussions that one is exposed to, with the students that one is working with, and etc. So I think it's also important to kind of think of it also in terms of what type of mystifications, what is the political economy at work in what we do institutionally. So anyway, that's I just wanted to say that.
Are there any questions from the audience here?
Thank you. My question had to do with disability. I feel like many of the topics that you've talked about, like guilt, shame, individualization of shame, body territory, lack, I feel like these all are connected a lot to the disabled body, and taking into consideration the work of authors such as Alison Kafer, Shak and Kim talking in integrating disability in feminism, the work of, I don't know, Jasbir Puar on how biopolitics work with the right to maim, that guide a lot of my own research. And I was wondering, how do you see the excess of ability in all of this, right? Considering how eugenics articulates coloniality, as well as sexuality, and yeah, all of this. I don't know what you think of that. Thank you.
I will only say very briefly that I think you're bringing up a very important question and a very important perspective, because the question of, from two points of view, right? In other words, what all the struggle, the theorizing and the experience that people with disability, have developed, what it can offer to actually deepen our understanding, of the situation of death, of the situation in which you encounter when everything is being taken from you, when in a sense, a war is waged on your bodies at all levels. And on the other hand, I think the power that the struggle, the people with disability have mounted over the years, also I think are very, very important in this moment to look at, because it's a moment in which I entitled one of my book Revolution at Point Zero, and I was inspired in that title by this Egyptian writer Nawal el-Saadawi, who, great Egyptian and activist, and she spoke, in a book she wrote the story of this woman, where the point zero signified the moment when all is lost. It's the post-possibility. Point zero is the post-possibility, when everything is lost. And at the moment, something, at the same time, the crisis of all that was there opens up possibilities. And I think it is very important, to dwell in that moment, precisely to see because that moment is also the moment when you give up the false solution. When you give up the false solution, whether it is the microcredit, whether it is, and in a way you pose seriously the question of how do you start all over? How do you begin to turn a new page, and with what force, with what? So thank you for bringing that perspective. I think it's very important.
Yeah, yes, I would like to respond briefly, and I think to one of the points we agreed, decided to cover, which Rocio brought, and then Sylvia now also mentioned, that the post possibility, which is it's one of the strange things about this moment, that while we, on the one hand, many are lamenting the end of something, others are saying, well, but it's never been there anyway. It's never been in place for all of us anyway. That is also the possibility, as, or call it a post possibility. I'm going to use the term possibility in its most general meaning here, that we can begin what we have not done so far, either because it's unthinkable given how we understand the political and the planning, or how we make sense of what a good life for everyone should be like. But it's but what becomes possible is to ask the question: what if we started from the very beginning with the assumption of how we should dispose of room, of whether or not people should be speaking at all, of whether or not we should be writing things, and or whether or not we should be doing everything at the same time. Right? The questions about how we go about doing the minimum things in life, attending to the different ways in which our bodies are operating and do and do not move, or is present or interact, or anything in the movement. So the question is, it's going to sound strange, but considering, reconsidering how we inhabit collectively with humans and more than humans in all the different modalities that we exist, that the body and the mind exist, considering asking the question of how to do anything that we take for granted, it's also open as a possibility. And when that question is asked, that question is posed, then we come, disability becomes a way, or different kinds of bodily and mental formations, constitutions, and operations that may be called disabled will come in all the plurality, right, informing the ways in which we just organize the minimum aspects of an interaction. So that we I think perhaps maybe that's a question for the other question about the outskirts or the out of that, which is a thing I usually like to say when I'm doing artwork, which is, to live in this world differently, to bring it to an end, we should just do that, just live in it differently, in the microest way possible. There's no great plan, right?
Yeah, I would only add that there is, I think, it's very important to make it explicit, the question of how bodies are understood, and how movement is understood, and how the world is structured to reproduce a very specific idea of body that is entirely connected to everything that we have been talking about. So I don't think we can talk about anything without having that being present. And so making that implicit is extremely helpful, important, and in particular to think about precisely. I mean, again, this question of yeah, I love what Denise just said. You know, maybe doing that which we have not been doing, if I understood correctly. Yeah, that those forms of thinking with Godreau, what to save is precisely tied to this question of embodiment, but also this cuerpo territorio, and what does it mean? Because of course it's a planetary question. This is also a question of the livability of the species and so on. So thank you for that very much.
I think, unfortunately, this brings us to the end of our time for this conversation, even though it's one that is urgent and ongoing. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our discussants, our presenters, and Denise, Silvia, Rocio, and to thank Sorimar for her moderation of the conversation, and thank all of you in the audience online and here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So much.
Un abrazo.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.